Concept video 2, disclosure in relationship life cycles. So here we're going to be talking about, let me pull that up, relationships and disclosure, social penetration, the Johari window, and then the different relationship stages. And within the first relationship stage, we're going to look at the filtering model. So this is just looking about how relationships are coming together and sometimes how they come apart. The relationship life cycle. So I really liked this quote by the book had, and it says, relationships are not something we have, but rather something we make as we communicate with others. I love that because it's very true. Relationships aren't just there. We have to actually develop them and maintain them to keep them going strong. So no two relationships are alike, but we do all, no matter what the relationship is, we all travel between the coming together stage and the coming apart stage. Some relationships don't come apart, so that's not necessarily there, but you're always traveling somewhere within that spectrum. So this is a constant movement, and then between those two stages, this is like the coming together at the beginning and then or the coming apart at the end. There's several stages in the between. So there's like the beginning and developing stage, and there's maintaining, and then declining and dissolving. So we're going to go into depth about those things later. But for now, I just wanted you to understand what the relationship life cycle is. So like your relationship, if you can think of a long-lasting one, how it's just kind of gone back and forth from time to time within those two identifiable phases. And usually the reason why it moves back and forth is because of the level of disclosure that you have. So disclosure is the process of revealing confidential information about yourself. Also, the feedback has a large part to do with that, so remember that from the communication model. But the feedback is the nonverbal and the verbal responses to such information. So how we respond and how people respond to us when either we self-disclose information or they disclose information to us. Okay, and then self-disclosure versus other disclosure. So self-disclosure is the confidential information we deliberately choose to share about ourselves with somebody, while other disclosure is confidential information we share about someone else to a third party. So like if someone told me something and then I went and told somebody else. Sometimes that is absolutely not okay. Like if your friend is like, hey, I'm trusting you with a really important secret. However, if it was something like risky, something to do with their health, someone's telling you something not okay, you might need to go tell somebody, a third party, right? So there's times that we need to do that, and there's times that we need to be trustworthy and not share that information. But this is the relationship life cycle, and this is kind of the basis for everything else we're going to be talking about. Before we move on to the different stages, let's look at a certain disclosure theory that is really important to the beginning stages of relationships. Social penetration model is basically a model that was constructed to show how self-disclosure differs and changes through as we get to know people, as we start beginning to share information about ourselves to others. So as it says here, this describes the different kinds of self-disclosure we use in our relationships. Not all self-disclosure is equally revealing. So some messages are going to tell the audience or the person we're talking to more about ourselves than others. And so we, through self-disclosure, decide what we're ready to share with people and why. And that really has a lot to do with how we want the relationship to develop. So one of the main things with social penetration model that is important that I want you to remember is that this is talking about breadth and depth. And what I mean by that is when we self-disclose information and like to another person, that relationship partner and us, we have a certain amount of breadth, meaning that a certain amount of subjects that we discuss. And then we have a certain quality to that information. So basically, how deep will we go with what we share with one another? So some people, you might have a friend that's been a long-lasting friend, but y'all really don't talk about that much, right? It's kind of limited and it doesn't go very deep. You don't get into that risky, confidential information. You kind of keep everything surface level. But then you may have an acquaintance that you meet and immediately are going, like maybe you haven't talked about a lot of topics, but you go really deep with the ones that you do. And then you have the intimate partners that like you could talk about anything with, that you actually talk about a lot of topics and you go deep with. So a lot of relationships, it just kind of shifts and changes, but especially at that beginning stage, when we start to have an acquaintance type relationship with somebody, we choose certain information probably based on the context, on however we know that person. And then slowly but surely, as we get to know somebody, if we want to continue developing that relationship, then we will start sharing, we'll maybe go a little bit deeper and start sharing more confidential information and maybe kind of broadening the subject areas that we talk about. So I gave you an example here, and basically it's just talking about how there's two students, and first, when they first met in class, they just start talking about like, oh yeah, where are you from? Hometowns, those kind of things. And just kind of like you would tell anybody. Might be on like your Facebook or other social media if you don't use Facebook. And so that's going to be real surface level, and personal chit chat. But over time, say these two students, they start studying together, they start hanging out more, maybe they get lunch after class here and there, and then they start talking. Well, then slowly they might be like, oh, so are you dating anybody? Or are you doing this? And they just start sharing a bit more information, or maybe they start telling you, oh yeah, like, so I told you I'm from so-and-so place, but I just really didn't like it there. And they start actually sharing deeper information about the subject areas you've already covered. So it kind of can be a lot of things, but social penetration is looking at how we start developing relationships, and we read someone's feedback, and we choose what we want to share self-disclosure wise. We choose that, and then we go deeper with that person. And the deeper we go, the more the relationship then develops. The next disclosure theory we're going to look at is the Johari window. So this looks at how disclosure and feedback operate within a relationship. So this is going to look more like kind of past the beginning stage and more into the developing stage and maintaining stage. So once you share information with someone, obviously they know that information that's there now. So, whenever you start to develop a friendship with somebody, say you're starting to grow closer, and so your relational closeness, how close you feel to that person, it's going to have a lot to do with the amount of self-disclosure you feel comfortable sharing, if they give appropriate feedback to what you say, and by appropriate meaning like what you were looking for. And then other disclosure, can you trust them? Is it, if you don't want them to share it, will they not? Those kinds of things. All that plays a huge part into whether or not you will disclose information to somebody and develop that relational closeness. So there are 4 parts to this window, and it all has to do with how much, like the information that is either discussed or known within that relationship. The first pane is the open pane, and so this is just any information that is known about both parties that, that depending on how close y'all are, like if you're an intimate friendship or if you're just an acquaintance, there might be a lot of stuff in that box, or there might not be that much. But this is just anything that you feel comfortable confiding into that person and telling them. And then there's going to be a secret pane. So secret, I guess that's down here. So secret is more so things that you know about yourself, but you haven't yet felt comfortable sharing with that person. You might feel comfortable, and maybe say that it's an acquaintance and you're starting to develop a friendship. So maybe when you really view them as a friend, then you'll start saying, okay, yeah, I'll share this information. But over time, secret information becomes known. But I will say sometimes secret information is secret not because you mean for it to be. It's just a topic maybe y'all haven't discussed yet, and so it just hasn't come up. So they don't know that about you. Then you have the blind. So the blind is information that the other person knows about you that you don't realize about yourself. And so this could be something as simple as like, oh, whenever they're nervous, they do this with their hands or something. They may notice that about you, but you've never actually noticed it. So they haven't told you, not maybe that they're trying to hide it, they just may not have thought to tell you about it yet. But sometimes we notice things about our relationship partners that we're like, I don't feel comfortable telling them that about themselves. And then maybe one day you're like, so there's something I was going to tell you. And then you have to feel comfortable sharing. But as soon as you do feel comfortable sharing and telling that person, then that goes into your open box. And so it's not necessarily how does that person feel about, like, how do they make you feel once they tell you. It's just like, at what point do you feel comfortable making that part of the open box or open pane? And then finally you have the unknown pane, and this is going to be the things that you just really don't know about yourself yet. And so this is kind of an awkward one, because people are like, well, how do you know that you don't know? It just may be that you haven't discovered that aspect about yourself either, or they haven't noticed it about you yet. It's kind of just things that, you may not know that you like a particular type of food until you try it. It's kind of like the same thing. You may not have discussed something or talked about it, and then, so you don't know how you think about it, or you may not know that that's something to tell people. So it kind of just depends. And that's the thing, is as we go on, as we develop friendships, that we'll just discover things about ourselves, and then we can choose at that point if we want it to be a secret or open part of that relationship. Let's look at the first stage of relationships. So I told you there's two phases, the coming together phase and then the ending phase. So starting at this end with the coming together phase, that we start with the beginning and developing stage of relationships. So to really understand these two stages and how we move from beginning a relationship to actually starting to develop that relationship, it has a lot to do with this model that you see here, the relationship filtering model. And so this is how we kind of pick it. Like, I don't want to say pick and choose. I don't like it being like, oh, I don't like you or I like you. But inevitably, when we start beginning relationships, just that initial starting to talk to somebody, we start out using that relationship filtering model. And then if we decide to continue going on and getting to know someone, then they're going to keep going down that filter. And then if they are someone we truly, truly connect with, then eventually over time, they're going to make it all the way through. But very few people make it all the way through. That's like when we think about like intimates. That's really how that goes. Okay, so to give you an example of what I'm talking about, whenever, say that you walk into a class and you're trying to pick where you're going to sit, and immediately, even if you don't mean for this to happen, but immediately you're going to look at everybody. Your brain's just going to immediately kind of be like, oh, who do I want to sit by? And most of the time, we sit by someone, if possible, we sit by someone that we feel like we have some assumed similarities with. And that's strictly based off of physical appearance. So that doesn't mean you have to think they're physically attractive. You might just think that, hey, it looks like they're close to my age, or maybe they're dressed similar to them. To me, like say you like working out and they're wearing workout clothes, you might be like, maybe they like working out. And it's not that you're like, I'm going to go talk to them about that, but you just notice things about them that make you feel a little bit more comfortable sitting by them. And that's just based off of physical appearance. So say you start talking in class, and because you're going to have to be in the class together for the whole semester and you're sitting next to each other. So you've now begun a relationship with each other, especially because say this class, you have to do a lot in groups. So you start communicating, you start talking. This is really just beginning. Again, this is just an acquaintance at this point, but over time, you may start to talk more about things. And so at first, they made it through the first filter. You sat by them just because of their physical appearance. But then also the second filter, you start talking, and then you notice that you both really like going really deep into conversation about things in the class, and you're really going on and on. And so they kind of get to a point of behavior and nonverbal communication. So here, people analyze, or we all do this, but we analyze people's communication behaviors. We see if we feel comfortable, if we like that, or we don't. And so say that person started acting the way, maybe they were kind of rude to other people in class, or they were rude to the teacher, and you may not like that. So you might be like, okay, you're just going to be an acquaintance, and I'm just going to have to do class with you. But maybe y'all really jive, you joke a lot, you get along well. And so you kind of really feel like, okay, maybe I want to be friends with this person. Well, now, they've made it through that behavior and nonverbal communication filter, at least for now. So you make it through, and now you're kind of getting to a point of developing, right? So we moved from beginning into developing a relationship. So then as you're developing relationships, both of you are going to kind of fall into roles, and you're going to start defining norms, like what is normal for this relationship, like our normal communication patterns, how we act, all those things. Like I'm the talker, they're the listener, those kinds of things that kind of fall into those roles. And if both people are comfortable with those roles, with the roles that are developing and the norms that are developing, and it's satisfying to them, then you kind of make it through that filter and you continue to develop. So then you get to the fourth filter, which is psychological similarity. So this might be after class, y'all start studying together, you go out to eat or you do things, and you go get coffee, and you start just talking about more topics. You start hearing going on more about them. They start self-disclosing more, because we've already talked about self-disclosure. But the more they self-disclose about themselves, you're like, oh, we really do have similar thoughts on a lot of things. And so I think that we stay there in that psychological similarity quite a bit, but we start to get to know someone, and then say like you really like over time like y'all really have so much in common, and then you like after the semester's over you continue to hang out and become like best friends, and that person then gets all the way through that last filter and becomes one of your like you would consider an intimate. Right, so you see how that gets traveled from just the beginning to through developing, but also from like acquaintance all the way down to intimate. So I think you can also count just a good friend as someone who makes it through that fourth filter as well. But in that example, I was using that. But you see, but at the same time, you can also kind of go up and down, right? So say that you have a normal communication pattern with this person, and then all of a sudden y'all start hanging out a lot and like you're doing life together, and then they start acting kind of weird. I see this sometimes like in dating relationships, especially like they start being different than what they used to be. The roles and the norms aren't the same, and then that makes you feel uncomfortable. So then you kind of come up a little bit, right? And that's why I was like, there's that relationship life cycles. You're kind of going back and forth because say you thought they were one way, but then they're acting different. So now you're like, hold up, I need to kind of go back through my filter a little bit, make sure that you're actually who you say you are. But then maybe they were just having like a bad day, like having had a couple of weeks at work, and now things are leveling out, and they apologize and they're back to normal, and then like you're good. Or you realize, no, this is really who they are and I can't deal with that, and so bye. So that's why you see how it kind of goes. You use this filter though as you go back and forth along that relationship life cycle. So that's really important, and I would love for you to start thinking about how this works in your own relationships. Next, let's look at the staying together stage, which this is stage 2, and it has to do with maintaining relationships. So this is after we've already made it through, and kind of like established a relationship with someone, either a friendship or an intimate relationship. And basically at this point, once we kind of officially, like we know we're friends, we know we have a relationship, then we go into what's called relational maintenance. And this is basically just some strategies that all people tend to do to keep their relationships healthy and thriving. So the first thing would be like pro-social behaviors, and pro-social behaviors are like politeness or respectfulness, things like that. Then you have observing ceremonial occasions, and that's going to be like going to their birthdays or recognizing them on certain things. Thanking, praising, expressing appreciation. It's important to do that. It's also important to do that publicly when given the opportunity, or even like whenever they're not around. I think that's a great thing to do too. You also want to communicate honestly and frequently about deep and everyday topics. So you want to have a wide breadth of topics, right? You want to be able to talk about a lot of things, from the everyday mundane to the actual like maybe more personal type topics, but you also want to be able to go deep about those things. So that's really important to good, healthy relationships. And then offering words and actions of affection and respect. So whether it is a romantic relationship or platonic relationship, we want to make sure that we are offering words of encouragement. We want to show through our actions that we care about the other person, that we respect them, whatever appropriate level of affection that might be. So those are all going to be some things that are really important to healthy relational maintenance. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit more about healthy relationships. So 2 things that partners do that have healthy relationships is they both have a level of sacrifice that they're willing to give. Remember we talked about being willing? Like you have to be willing to have some types of sacrifices every now and then about personal desires. I mean, not everything can be your way all the time. So that's important to recognize. And then respectfully manage conflict by offering apologies and providing forgiveness. So one of the worst things, the most detrimental things to a relationship is holding on to things and not being able to forgive. So you want to definitely ask for forgiveness. Don't sweep stuff under the rug. I mean, eventually that's going to deteriorate a relationship. So you want to make sure that you discuss things respectfully, but you also talk about, give apologies, and you also give forgiveness if you want your relationship to stay healthy. The last stage deals with the last phase, which the last phase is coming apart. But the last stage is the declining and dissolving of relationships. So when relationships start to come apart, really what's happening is that either one or both partners are failing to engage actively in relational maintenance strategies, and the relationship may begin to come apart and could eventually end. So this might be that one person's really trying, the other person's not, and then eventually that person stops doing the relationship maintenance. So it's not really like, I would say that both people just decide one day to stop, although they might. But in a lot of cases, I feel like it kind of is back and forth, and then eventually it just kind of dissipates. So here are the 4 stages of the decline. So the declining to dissolving is what first happens is circumscribing. So this is when communication decreases in both quantity and quality. So maybe you talked about a lot of things before, and maybe you talked really in-depthly, but then maybe you notice that the communication is starting to kind of not happen as often, or maybe it's kind of just, you can't get the person to talk a lot, or vice versa. They can't get you to talk a lot because you're just not wanting to talk really. So it usually starts with communication, because you remember what I said before. If you can think of a friend that all of a sudden you're like, you know what? I don't really know what happened. I don't know why we don't talk anymore. If you really think about it, it started with just a little bit of distance in their communication, and then that communication continuing to kind of distance or not happen as frequently, and then it just kept on going. So that's circumscribing. That's what happens sometimes, even in friendships. This doesn't always have to do with romantic relationships. So then there's stagnating. And this is when the relationship starts going through the motions and interacting without enthusiasm or emotion. So the people within that relationship are just kind of like, oh yeah, we're just here. So you're just kind of like, hey, there's nothing really just sparking anything. There's I think that loss of communication in general makes you start to kind of not feel close or excited to talk with that person. And then you have avoiding. So avoiding can be active, like you actively try to avoid. I know sometimes with my boyfriends in middle school, I kind of went that route with breakups. Don't do that. That's not good. But I went that route sometimes because I hated hurting people's feelings. But inevitably, I hurt people's feelings by avoiding. All that to say, avoiding can sometimes just naturally start to happen. Like, especially if your communication starts becoming limited, you may just stop making plans together. Not necessarily even that you're trying to do it in a mean way. Y'all haven't talked, so then you decide to do something with somebody else that night. So you start creating this distance between the two of you, both physically and maybe emotionally, and then also you start making excuses for not doing things together. Finally, terminating. So terminating is when partners decide the relationship is no longer worth maintaining. And this could be one person or it could be both people, but it's basically saying, okay, this isn't worth this. What this is not a relationship anymore, not one that I want to be a part of. And then there's grave digging. And this is whenever I say, like, if you were having to have a breakup conversation with somebody and you're trying to attempt to explain why the relationship failed. That's called grave digging. Sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes I don't think it is. It just kind of depends on the relationship and why that is there. I mean, sometimes it's like a friendship that, kind of became close, but then it just kind of dissipated quickly. And it's kind of that weird, do we talk? Do I tell them why this is happening? Or maybe like you dated someone for a short period of time, or maybe very short, and then you decide you don't want to see them again, and you're like, I don't really know do I break up with them? It's kind of that situation. But there might be some reasons why we want to grave dig, but we also don't want to sit there and just like spiral down a hole because sometimes that can just lead to like hurt feelings. All right, so then the other thing we want to know about coming apart is that sometimes the relationship doesn't just end, sometimes it transforms. So maybe, this is kind of like, I think about my friend who got a divorce recently, and her husband are both really trying to be good co-parents. So while their marriage ended, they now have transformed that relationship to a different type. So the communication has changed, their interactions have changed. There's different norms that go on with that relationship now. So sometimes relationships end, or they just transform, meaning they shift, or they're different. And sometimes that could be like you're friends with somebody, and then you decide that you actually want to be romantic partners, and that's a relationship transformation as well. So it comes to an end of a friendship and then to a romantic partner. So those relationship transformations, and so how we handle coming apart, how we handle that with our communication, it's really important. Again, even if it is a relationship that's ending, we should still try to communicate in a healthy and respectful way when ending it. Here are this video's exam prep questions. Go ahead and pause the video,
Write your answers, possibly think of your why for each answer, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Now for your reflection question. Pause the video and answer, and then press play to end the video.